Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Rob Willis. I'm with Ross Strategic. I use the pronouns he, him. I'm going to be the individual moderating the call today. I'm going to spend about 1 minute here talking to you about how we plan to use the Zoom interface. Hopefully, you've used Zoom before. I ask that you keep yourselves muted while you are on the call, unless you are speaking. You can toggle your mute on and off by pressing the old-timey looking microphone labeled similar to what's labeled number 1 up there on the screen. I invite you to turn your video on. You can turn your video on by toggling it on and off using the start-stop video button labeled number 2. We are going to be using the chat today. And the way you access the chat is by pressing the chat icon, like the one labeled number 4 up there. It will open up a separate dialog box. What I like doing is I like dragging that to a different part of my screen, so I'm able to have my video and my chat separate. If you are interested or need live captioning, we are using live captioning setting in English. You can press the live transcript button, which is number 5, and select show subtitle, and that will enable your captioning. If you've got captioning on and you want to turn it off, you use the same process. You press the live transcript button and select hide subtitles, and that will hide your subtitles. I am going to be using the raise hand feature. The way you raise your hand is by pressing the reactions button, and then you can hit the raise lower hand button. If you prefer a keyboard shortcut because you're a creature of WordPerfect like I was, you can hit Alt-Z, and that will raise and lower your hand. Now, if you had WordPerfect on your bingo card, you can take that one. The last button I want to draw your attention to is the participants button. That's button number 3. If you press that button, again, it will open up a separate dialog box, and it will let you know who is on the call with you. And so I want everyone to go ahead and press that button for me. And Sarah, if you could advance the slide. Because it is in that participants box where you have the opportunity to rename yourself in Zoom, and I'm asking that you please do that. It's very helpful for us who are responsible for moderation. The way you rename yourself in Zoom is you go ahead and scroll through that list and find yourself in that list. You press the ellipse button, and you can toggle over your name, and you can choose more or rename, and then it'll open up another dialog box where I ask that you, in addition to your name, put your organization and your preferred pronouns if that's something that you are willing to share. So I'm going to give folks a few seconds to do that. And while you're doing that, I'll draw your attention to a little graphic that we have on the screen there. And that is a pie chart that we put together based on registration. That is what sector the registration is from. You'll see that about 23 of the folks that have registered, or about 56%, are from academic institutions. And then I've got the legend on that slide. So, John, what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn it over to you to kick off the call, and then we'll go over to Jenny. John?
Sure. Great. Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Dombrowski. I'm the Director of the Office of Compliance within the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance here at EPA, and I want to thank everyone for taking the time out to attend this meeting today. We got some interesting, we have an interesting research topic we want to talk to everyone about. A special thanks goes out to North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnership for all the help you've been giving us, if you will, to get us to this point. We are, again, incredibly excited to talk to you about this research opportunity and look forward to a great collaboration. Some of folks on the phone may have heard this already, but I'm going to go over it again, a little bit of background about this effort and how we got to this point. And Office of Compliance is really, we're leading an initiative to build a foundation for a national evidence-based enforcement and compliance assurance program designed to achieve higher levels of compliance and resulting environmental benefits from EPA's compliance and enforcement activities. And this would be the state's enforcement compliance activities too, possibly, as well as our tribal partners. The evidence-based building effort expands upon OECA's previous next generation compliance principles to embrace technology transparency to promote compliance with environmental laws. So we had next gen before, We're bringing that back and we're building upon it, if you will. One of the main components of this evidence building initiative is the development of the compliance learning agenda, identifying the most pressing unanswered environmental compliance questions and establishing an evaluation plan with a series of research projects intended to address those questions. While not officially part of the agency's learning agenda, we see this as part of the broader efforts under the Evidence Act, which this is all transpired from. In 2021, we partnered with E-Enterprise Leadership Council and collaborated with a group that included EPA, states, tribes, academics to identify our first set of priority questions. I know that some on this call today actually participated and were part of that effort, and we're grateful for the work that you've done to get us again to this point. 3 areas that came to the top were, one was the evaluation of the effectiveness of off-site compliance monitoring. And then we have today's topic, which is the root cause of municipal noncompliance. And then finally, we're still evaluating the third topic, and that's injunctive relief. But today we're here to talk about the root causes of municipal noncompliance. So I guess with that, I will turn it over to our colleagues in North Carolina, and I believe, Jenny, you're up.
Thank you so much, John and team. It's been a pleasure working with you all, and Rob and team as well. I'm really excited to have the second meeting underway. I see that somebody put up the slides, so I'm just going to use that quickly to guide my very brief comments, and then we can pull the slides down, and I'll say a couple more things about today's discussion and what we hope to accomplish with all of you. I'll also reiterate the invitation to put your, maybe not right this second with slides up, to put your cameras on if you're willing and able. It's nice to see people and helps the discussion, especially later when we have time for some Q&A. So just quickly, as John and somebody said, I am Jenny Owen, the Director of the North Carolina of Strategic Partnerships. We are an office that is housed within the Office of State Budget and Management in North Carolina, a cross-cutting office that works with agencies across the state. So that's the Cabinet, Council of State agencies, and others. And you're our first partner at the federal level, which has been very exciting and different, but not entirely different, where we continue with our efforts to help agencies identify their research priorities if they don't have them. So kudos, of course, to all of you for having a well-established learning agenda that you're continuing to flesh out, and then work with the agency to identify potential research partners. And as those of you on the line know from academic institutions and other potential partner organizations and individuals, there's huge interest in the academic community and partnering with government, huge interest in government and partnering with people in the academic community that have expertise to share to help bring evidence research into the government arena and do a better job of using data and evidence in decision making, but often not a path to connect those two. And that's what we've really tried to establish a process for in North Carolina that we're happy to share and spread and let you use as much as would be helpful to any of you at any level of government. So quickly, here is just a few links that might be helpful to you. I think this will go out after the recording, after the meeting, and will be part of the recording that you'll have access to as well. You can go to the next slide if you could, which I think is the last slide. A few other resources for those of you who might be interested more in what we do and some of the cross-cutting work that's largely about government research partnerships, but also spreads into engagement with philanthropy, not just for their money, but for the other types of partnership and engagement they bring to really important issues of policy and practice. And then a couple of things at the bottom there that we invite you to join us on monthly for our monthly Connect, and then monthly also to receive a highlights update in which an example would be something like this would be featured as a resource for people to go to. So you can pull the slides down. Thanks for the opportunity to share just a little bit about us. I know a couple of my colleagues from OSP are on as well, so I'm glad they could join. And want a big shout out to not only to the EPA team and Robin team, but to Ruth Weigel, our doctoral associate, and Eliza Edwards, our deputy director, who really helped to pull these gatherings together. So just quickly to set the stage for how we typically do this, and it worked quite well, I think, last time, but defer to Rob for any on-the-fly adjustments we might need to make. This is a very open type of conversation, and something that many people in academia, in my experience, and I believe in government as well, aren't used to, in terms of having an opportunity to go back and forth with a potential government partner on a research project where you may be in the middle of this conversation, asking questions about data use and data sharing and budget opportunities and timing, all the sorts of things that you would want to ask to get a handle on whether this might be a project that you're interested in proposing a partnership with EPA. I'm just going to keep saying EPA instead of OECA for ease of understanding, something that you may not be used to doing. And we greatly appreciate your willingness, people in academic community and research community more broadly, your generosity in sharing your questions and ideas, your suggestions that EPA colleagues may take and potentially even refine some of the question and what they're trying to pursue. So any level of candor and questioning and offers of insight about how to handle this research question are quite welcome by the EPA team and appreciated. And we have even seen at times an agency, at least in North Carolina state government, either stopping pursuit of a particular question until they do more due diligence, what I don't think is going to be the case here because they're far enough along in exploring this, or in refining some of what the need might be or the types of data sort of use and analysis and so on that might be most helpful. So thanks again, everybody, for being open to having that sort of a conversation. The only other thing I would say is that I think Rob is going to be the master sort of puller of comments and questions from the chat when we get to that point. It is my privilege to be able to introduce the next speaker, who's a subject matter expert for the discussion. And Rob, before I do that, let me just pause for a minute. Give me a thumbs up if there's anything else you wanted me to speak to, and otherwise I will go ahead and introduce Beth Ravnath. Okay, so I will go ahead and do that. So thank you, Beth, who is with EPA, and as I said, is a subject matter expert for this project. We look forward to the conversation, and I and Ruth on our team will be on hand to help in any way we can for the rest of this conversation. Beth, over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. Go ahead and share my slides here. Somebody let me know that these have popped up. It looks like it's working. Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Beth Ravnath. I have seen a few familiar names and faces on this call, which is always nice. I work in EPA's Office of Compliance, and my current role is as the lead for the National Enforcement and Compliance Initiative on reducing significant noncompliance in the NPDES program. So a bit more on the wastewater side here. And today, as we've noted, we're talking about our question related to understanding root causes of municipal noncompliance. Let's see. And now my slides don't want to advance. There we go. So first of all, why do we want to focus on municipal noncompliance? So in the water sector, which is the primary interest for these questions at EPA at the moment, we're talking about wastewater, that's the NPDES program in the Clean Water Act, and drinking water, the Safe Drinking Water Act. Municipally owned facilities are subject to some factors and constraints that are different than privately owned facilities regulated under these laws. For example, and we can get into this a little bit more later, but they may have local rules about how much they can pay an operator that's anybody that's employed by the city, or they may have limits on how much they can increase their rates, where their funding can come from. Obviously, those things are largely not issues in the private sector, even if they have similar operations or similar types of facilities. In addition, regulators in both wastewater and drinking water have found that these facilities can be particularly challenging to maintain longer-term compliance. Understanding these root causes, what would we do with this information? Why is this important to regulators? We want to be able to do our jobs better to better target inspections. We may be able to better tailor compliance assistance efforts, use our resources more efficiently in that area to focus on key issues. We might be able to identify ways permitting or enforcement programs could make some programmatic changes that could increase likelihood of non-compliance or of compliance up front, and also just to select which kinds of enforcement or compliance assurance activities are most likely to result in improved compliance at a given facility. What do we currently know here? We've been working, as I mentioned, on the significant non-compliance reduction in the NPDES program. We have a national initiative to do that. And as part of that, we've noted that about a third of NPDES individual permits, which is what that initiative is focused on, are issued to publicly owned treatment works, where we refer to POTWs, the municipally owned facilities just treating domestic wastewater. And about a third of them are what we call major POTWs. So that's a design flow greater than or equal to 1.0 million gallons per day. And 2/3 are non-major, or sometimes referred to as minor POTWs. When we look at significant non-compliance for individually permitted facilities, POTWs have higher rates of SNC than non-POTWs, true for both of both majors and non-majors, and also non-majors have higher rates of SNC than major POTWs. So just kind of a couple quick facts and figures on those, on kind of that sector. We also have identified, based on a wealth of professional experience from state and EPA practitioners that spend a lot of time working with these facilities and these specific cases, some likely factors affecting compliance at municipally owned wastewater treatment facilities that could be investigated. We can go through some of these. Operator pay and turnover could be factors that folks see correlated with non-compliance at facilities. They may have, as I mentioned, formal limitations, or maybe they simply can't afford to pay operators, or they may have turnover because of the job market, other availability of workers. There could be operator qualifications or training. Some states have certification structures and requirements for operators for some facilities. Also, they may just not have operators that have the right training. Also, could kind of these kind of can get complicated, because if they don't have qualified operators because of pay turnover, where is really the root, the main factor? Some of these get tied up together. Also, the questions about whether training alone can change behavior, that can be interesting. Sometimes there's the motivational factors there that come into play. And also in this area, we also have some work that has been increasingly funded in the recent past, with some money that we've gotten from Congress being dispersed for greater technical assistance efforts. So that could play in here, be an area of inquiry because of the increase in technical assistance availability, to see how that affects compliance at these POTWs. Another area is funding for both capital improvements and operation and maintenance. We have heard in some cases about facilities getting funded for an upgraded system, but then they still weren't compliant because they couldn't afford the chemicals or the filters or whatever was required of this system, or the system was too sophisticated for the skills of the operators available to them. So, we often hear about funding being a big factor, but, there's a lot of nuance in the funding. Again, big chunks of funding becoming available for infrastructure projects is maybe a key time to be able to leverage new activities for research purposes. We also have population transition factors that some have suspected influence ability to comply, both depopulation or sudden increased population, a facility not able to keep up, or a facility without a tax base, serving a decreasing number of people. And also one interesting factor could be the characteristics of the municipal entity that owns the facility. Is it, how much of a professional staff do they have at the city? Is it a small town with just, a very small structure? Is it just, the mayor responsible for the facility, or do they have like an environmental department doing a lot of things in the municipality? We also are, part of the partnering is being able to support research for wastewater. We certainly can reach out, help connect with states that might have additional data, more than what EPA has. We also have connections to a lot of professionals across the country who do this type of work, or who may have states that may have some different characteristics to how they run their program, some different structures that may be of interest. We have quite a good relationship with a lot of our states, and good connections that we've made as part of our national initiative, and have been able to connect researchers with states as well. And also, of course, to understanding the data that EPA has, being able to help interpret where things come out in any sort of data analysis, or any questions about program operation from permitting, compliance, enforcement nuances. In the drinking water context, we've seen some similar things. Really, seasoned professionals have noted that small systems that are financially challenged or have source water issues are the most common facilities or characteristics that seem to point toward likelihood of non-compliance. EPA has also reviewed some predictive tools that have been developed, and those predictive tools have correlated these 5 factors to non-compliance. Again, operator certification, kind of paralleling some suspicions in the wastewater side, source water, financing of issues, the system size or population issues, and here also previous violations or history of non-compliance have been factors that have been identified by these predictive tools. So what questions are we really still trying to answer that will help us move forward here with stronger evidence? We are trying to identify, support with more evidence, the most common drivers of municipal noncompliance, the strongest predictors. What can regulators do ultimately to improve compliance where these drivers exist? And also trying to kind of make those connections to see the relationship between specific causes of municipal noncompliance and the success or failure of a particular intervention to produce or sustain compliance at these facilities. And that is the end of my slides. So we can open for questions, I think. And Rob, I will take my slides down so we can.
I'd like to jump in and mention one thing, just to hit it head on. I know there's probably questions out there about the funding for this effort. I don't have an answer for you just yet on that because I have not received my full operating budget. The goal is to fund this, but at what level and all that we still need to figure out. So just be aware. I don't have that information off at hand at the moment, but that hopefully will be coming. The other thing with respect to the first effort, the offsite compliance monitoring effort, which is the first item that we wanted to launch in the study, and we're close to making a selection on that process on which, how we're moving forward with the research on that. So just giving you a heads up on those two items. I'm sure everyone has that budget question, and then the status of where we are in offsite compliance monitoring. Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Beth. Okay, so this is how we want to run it. In my mind, there are several kinds of questions you could ask. We could ask clarifying questions. And if you want us to go back to a certain slide, I'm happy to do that. If history be our guide from our last call, there were also some questions like, did you think about or have you thought about types of questions? And then there are also kinds of questions where on the last call, folks were beginning to think through what would attacking the question look like. And so we're open to all kinds of those questions. I don't have anything in the queue, so I'm going to maybe invite someone either just to unmute themselves and jump in, or you can raise your hand by hitting the reactions button and raise hand. And I am really looking for one brave soul to get us rolling.
I can ask a question. This is Greg Pierce from UCLA. It's
Great,
maybe an
Greg.
obvious,
And then
obvious
Paul,
one.
come to you next.
But are you defining municipal simply as publicly owned, or is actually within publicly owned city run specifically? I realize they may be one and the same almost universally in some places, but in others they're not. And then second, I assume you'd be interested in looking at non-municipal systems, however they're defined in comparison to municipal systems, to answer these questions, as that would be a sort of a more fruitful way to look at differences analytically.
I think in wastewater, at least, and I defer, we have some folks who are have stronger backgrounds in the drinking water sector than I do. In wastewater, we have some identifiers in our data system that note that determine what help us filter what we count as a publicly owned treatment works. Largely, we are not talking about like federally owned, publicly owned, but smaller entities, like county, city level ownership there. I don't think that we are looking to constrain whether a project makes comparisons to privately owned treatment works that treat similar types of discharges, domestic sewage and such. But there are, I think we'd have to look at what a proposal looked like and what it was aiming to answer, to see whether that seemed like it would help answer the questions that we have, or what the proposal would include to that effect.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Greg, does that answer your question? Did you have any follow-up? And then Paul, I'll come to you next.
No, that answered it. Thank you.
Great. Paul, jump in.
Well, I was just jumping in because I can't stand silence and that awkward waiting. There's no other hands up. I'm happy to go. So, Beth, I'm just trying to understand where you think EPA is in what they want, right? So with these sorts of questions, you can go for one of these, what they often call all cause analysis. You often see these exploratory, the drivers of, or the determinants of non-compliance. And it's really best for hypothesis generation. You're looking at correlates, comparative case studies, interviews, surveys, and you're trying to generate hypotheses of what are the most likely things to look at in subsequent studies, or you've already narrowed it down. I couldn't tell, it looks like you may have, and maybe you want us to focus on some one or two particular causes where the EPA could actually affect through its actions, and you want to get more confirmatory evidence. Is this really something that matters, and how much, and could we affect it? So I'm just trying to get a sense of, you're still really looking for ideas and want to do exploratory work, or are you I think you've got a good set from all your past experience and studies. You really want to zero in on a few causes or potential causes and do more confirmatory work on those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Paul. I think that we've got, I'm an explorer by nature, and I don't want to leave anything out of the confines if it could be a good reason and I just haven't thought about it. And so I think that I don't want to necessarily draw those lines. That being said, the government has currently investing a large amount of money on thinking that there's a big funding problem, right? And that there's a big technical assistance need. There's a lot of money going toward technical assistance, a lot of money going through to infrastructure upgrades. So clearly somebody thinks these are the biggest, most likely reasons for driving non-compliance. And it could be of a high level of interest to a large amount of people to certainly not leave those two out. I think that that could be, those could have a high, those in particular could have a high amount of interest in knowing what's happening for those two pieces, just because where are we putting tax money? Is that the right place? Is that going to work? Is that really the root cause? But also, if that's not going to work, why is that not working? What are we missing? What are those things that are deeper that are going to render throwing money at it not to solve the problem?
Yeah, I want to add to that. We know what we know, right? We have data, we have ISIS, we know what the compliance issues are based on data mining, but however, that may not be everything. The things that were on Beth's list, that's a good list. But Paul, there may be something else out there that we're not aware of and haven't focused on, and we should. So I think it's kind of open. We're open for other causes, if you will. We're not pretending to know these are the root causes that we want more info on.
I just want to just caution you that you probably will have to eventually decide, because I know.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're at that decision point just yet on which one to focus on.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I've got Deborah, then Stephen. Deborah, please.
Yeah, I had a little trouble jumping over from Teams to the Zoom, so I missed the very beginning of the presentation. So you may have covered this, and I may have missed it. But is there? So I understand in what we were just talking about that we're sort of open to what those root causes of non-compliance are. But is there a particular area of non-compliance that is most interesting to examine, either because the rates of non-compliance are that much higher, or because the consequences of non-compliance are just much more dire? Is there any sort of particular direction on that end that EPA is most interested in going into?
So at least for wastewater, I would say we usually lump the non-compliance, at least for significant non-compliance, which is what my work focuses on, into kind of non-reporting, effluent violations, and then non-compliance with your like compliance schedule, with your enforcement order. So we sort of think about it in those buckets largely. I think that the most I think that we're focusing more increasingly on the non-compliance with your effluent limits. Non-reporting is super interesting, and we're definitely interested in looking there as well. But I think in terms of is infrastructure the problem? Is where are we making environmental difference? Sometimes non-reporting can be covering those up, and sometimes not being able to comply with your compliance schedule that's part of enforcement action can give us a lot of interesting information as to digging in what isn't working. If you're already doing enforcement, why are they still not complying? So I think, I mean, I'm not sure if that really answered your question. very
Beth,
well.
I could add something here that might be helpful too,
Yeah.
real quick. So it is the significant non-compliance that we usually use as our yardstick, right, when it comes to effluent violations. But you could also have single event violations, bypass relates or overflows that could also contribute to SNC, significant non-compliance. What might be helpful, Beth, I'm wondering if we could send out a fairly good definition of SNC to this group, so they'll have some basis for understanding what significant non-compliance is, because that's generally what we focused on.
And then I would be curious for the drinking water, since you spoke mostly about wastewater, what your answer would be there.
Hi, this is Leslie Cronkite, and I'll take a crack at responding to that. I think we are sort of focused on systems that have problems with chronic noncompliance, and that could be, depending on the system size, it could be different sets of regulations. But I do think it might make sense to focus in on rules, because you may have differing causes based on the rule. For instance, we know that treatment technique rules, which are more complicated, have higher rates of noncompliance than sort of simpler rules. Again, we're going to focus on the chronic noncompliance problems, but it may be that we need to break that down.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, John, and thank you, Deborah. I've got Stephen, Susan, and then Srinivas, if I pronounce that correctly. Stephen?
Good afternoon, everyone. So this is really interesting. It's fun to see EPA moving in this direction. I have a couple questions. The first really is about scope. Like, if you're looking at handling this, there are two ways you could do it, which was one would be really looking at a lot of data and analyzing data. And the other way would be actually going out to communities and doing the kinds of field work, case study kinds of things. Do you have a sense of what you're, so, and there's trade-offs, right? If you're doing a lot of data, then you're going to get you'll get information that's pretty broad, but not particularly deep in terms of what are the drivers. And then the other way, you can get information that's deep, but you're at the beginning of understanding the breadth, right? The second thing, though, is this question about it's actually the classic EPA question, which is problematic for those of us who work in rural areas. EPA wants to separate water and wastewater, and yet in small utilities, often they're combined utility systems. So to what extent are you rigidly dividing, or is there room to start thinking about these as conjoint problems?
Anyone from EPA want to take either of those questions? So the first question has to do with approach, large data versus potentially more face-to-face. And then the second question has to do with scope regarding wastewater, water, and split.
Well, I would say those are really good questions that I haven't thought about. I think, if it makes sense to do the combination of wastewater and drinking water, because they run as sort of one entity. It seems like there could be room for that. And then what was the second question again?
The second question, Leslie, was about the kind of research, whether broad-based data research.
I think I could have a response to that one. From where we sit, right, in headquarters in DC and all that, we're trying to have the broadest impact we possibly can. Okay, with what we come up with, kind of getting more bang for the buck, so to speak. However, I know at a state or local level, they're probably more interested in the more deep dive type of approach because they're interested in the systems within their area, right? They don't have to try to do a broad brush across the country. So what I would suggest is the goal is what we end up with this study that we can then evaluate it and hopefully come up with potential approaches to mitigate it, but it would touch as many POTWs as possible. And whatever tools we come up with not only could be utilized by EPA, but could be utilized by our state partners and tribes. So again, you're talking a pretty broad brush, right? That's what I would think. Maybe it's a broad brush and then there might be 1 or 2 areas in that broad brush we want to do a deep dive and focus in on. That could be an approach too. But just giving you from our perspective on where we sit.
Great. Now, next participant is Susan from state agency. So Susan, I don't know if you want to disagree with what John said or or anything, but please, Susan, jump in.
Well, it's kind of building onto it as opposed to actually disagreeing. I have a couple of different things in mind. I'm going to try to organize it to get this all out at once. So I'm more closely tied to the drinking water programs than wastewater. So I can't speak as authoritatively, although I do work with both. I'm in the water side of my department. So the first thing is that what jumped out at me is, talking about small systems being what prior experts have pointed to. They're the ones having the problems. And also your research about POTW minors, the non-majors, really matches with 20 or 30 years of our experience. So I would be really interested in something where you guys do a proof of concept, a pilot where you have, small drinking water systems and POTW minors, and you sort of drill down into what are the specific non-compliance tied to one or more particular rules. That was something I think maybe Leslie brought up that really resonated for me, because sometimes when you look at the whole group, the data would seem to take you in one direction, but then when you break it down, it turns out that most of what you're looking at is something else entirely. So I think that ability to break it down by rule would be really, really useful. So when I think about drinking water, from my perspective, it's part of it is the total overload of the world we live in. So the drinking water program, there's just so many more regulations and rules and things we have to teach people than even 30 years ago. And of course, we can't keep up with it. So I think for the operators also, there is this overload because they've got to deal with cybersecurity, which is pretty much new to everybody. They have to deal with the revised total coliform rule, the revised lead and copper rule, and then anything and everything to do with PFAS. So part of it can just be this sort of total overload, and we have to figure out how we're going to be training more operators and give them what type of compliance assistance works, in terms of helping people deal with this huge overload of new rules that just keep on rolling out so that their heads are spinning. They can't keep up. So I'm certainly very interested in anything to do with attracting and retaining operators and getting people trained, reaching down to the tech schools, getting young people interested in pursuing that career. At least in Massachusetts, we've got a lot of people retiring and walking away. We've got a real shortage of qualified operators on both wastewater and drinking water, especially drinking water. So I guess the last piece I want to add to my little tirade here is that we do a lot of compliance assistance in Massachusetts, especially on the drinking water side. And there can be kind of a bit of a tension between an EPA focus on counting the beans. How many inspections did you do? How many enforcement actions did you do? Versus what kind of compliance assistance you did. And part of that is because the results of compliance assistance are complicated to measure, as you guys are finding as you start this project. and counting inspections and enforcement is pretty easy. But I think it's kind of useful for all of us when we talk about a compliance and enforcement. We all know what we mean by enforcement, but that compliance isn't just assessing compliance via inspections and report reviews. That if there's more ways to credit state programs for their compliance assistance and outreach, then people do what they get attention for and what the push is to do. So I think those are the three areas that I was focusing on, that I'd like to see some type of pilot that really drills down with one or more rules regarding drinking water small systems, POTW minors. I'd like to see efforts that sort of how do we figure out how to help operators deal with this profusion of responsibilities that kind of keeps exploding. And then how do we sort of better value and credit compliance assistance? With all that said, and I know I'm sort of spitting out a lot, I still believe money is the most important factor. Like in terms of real measurable turning SNCCs into complying regulated community, it's our state revolving loan fund. You know, we can talk about CSOs on the Merrimack all day and night, but until we have money to fix them, you know, they're going to keep flowing. So, you know, that's my take from the state. I know that's a lot, but I hope that gives you a couple of different directions that might be useful. So thank you.
Great. Susan, thank you. Next I have Srinivas and then Ashley.
Thanks. I have two related questions. One is about a scope question. The other is about potential recommendations. So the scope question is drilling down into like what non-compliance looks at and what your sort of objective analysis might be. So, right, someone previously said not reporting, but how about like erroneous reporting, fraudulent reporting, different statistical anomalies in the pattern of reporting patterns for a municipality over time, right? Those could all be sort of ways of detecting non-compliance with a broader sort of umbrella of what non-compliance is. And then the other question, since I'm a political scientist, is about what the recommendations might be, right? So there are a decent number of municipal water providers that are like, they provide water as part of a consortium of municipalities. So if one of the recommendations or one of the findings is that sort of banding together with the provision of water leads to higher compliance, that's not really an actionable recommendation to give municipalities that may not want to let go of control over their own sort of water ownership. So I'm interested in what your like set of actionable recommendations might be that you're looking for.
Beth, I see you've gone off of mute. And then you're waiting. I saw John.
So yeah, no, I'm off. I could give some I could give some quick thoughts on that. So to the first part of your question with respect to scope and how to study this problem, so to speak. Well, that's in part why we're soliciting your input, right? You guys are the researchers, you know, the cutting edge ways to take data, evaluate data, look at it, or set up a study. We have done in past, now that we have like the DMR data, discharge monitoring report data coming in electronically, we actually have done some statistical analysis on it to see if we could find fraud. And we did actually find some fraud. But that was one approach, that was one technique. So that's where we're kind of looking for you guys for ideas on how to evaluate this problem, right? Maybe it's a combination of field and data. Maybe it's just data. But that's what we got to figure out going forward. What's an efficient way to do this? The second one was, what do we hope to end up with when we're said and done here? Where do we go with it? All right, we completed a study. We found, a couple root causes, maybe different ways. Now what? And that's a good question. And I would say at that point, it all depends on what we find. It could be compliance assistance material, right? Training, webinar type of stuff, fact sheets. It could be potentially developing new targeting tools, okay, for our state and EPA to help them identify even where whatever problems we're finding are, they're able to find them at other POTWs, maybe through targeting using data. Maybe it's a combination of those. Maybe it could also be some targeted inspections. So we're out there with the states and seeing in the field if that we're finding those violations as well. So I'm going to say where we end up with and what is the remedy or solution or appropriate thing to develop. It all really depends on what we find. And what's the best mechanism, and is it large facilities or small facilities? You might have a different approach depending upon the size of the POTW too. So we're at the ground zero here, and where we take this is kind of up to us and how we mold this study going forward. I don't know, Beth, if you want anything to add.
I think you covered it. I think we're looking not necessarily at recommendations to make to facilities. There's going to be, we're trying to come up with ways that regulators could do better. And, maybe that does feed into some things that you might require in an order, or you might suggest to a facility, or you might, there's not a complete bifurcation there. But, we're looking to eventually to increase compliance, but also to,
that's the ultimate goal, right? To improve compliance. How you get there? Well, first, what's the problem? Let's see if we could identify that, and then we can figure out what's going to be effective.
Great, thank you. So we've got about 17 minutes left here. And so we've got 3 people in the queue, 17 minutes, so we're doing great on time. So we definitely have space for more questions. I also want to draw people's attention to the chat box where Paul put in some thoughts in there. And so please feel free to follow that lead as well. So I've got Ashley, David, then Bridget. Ashley, jump in.
Yeah, my name is Ashley Voskuhl. I'm with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and I just want to reiterate pretty much everything Susan just said. Is pretty much consistent with everything all of the states would say, but I guess something that I want to bring up is just a thought, I guess, and I have an enforcement background, so looking at systems who have returned to compliance and the methods that the states used to get those systems into compliance and why those systems were out of compliance in the first place, I think is a good place to start or to look into. I mean, they kind of fall, from my previous experience, a lot of systems fall into maybe little buckets, and then sometimes have very similar problems with very similar solutions. Sometimes they don't, they're not implemented as well, but I definitely think some back and forth with the states is really important here, because they have a very deep level of understanding of a lot of these issues, and what are causing them, and what has allowed people to succeed and return to compliance as well.
Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the states, we have to work with our states, and hence why we invited state partners and ECOS to this call, right? And that's going to be our plan going forward, to continue to have our state partners engaged in this effort.
Great, thank you, Ashley. I've got David and Bridget. David, jump in.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for doing this call with us. I guess I have a question about data. I've used EPA enforcement data for many years, and in every exercise, I end up with more questions and answers, trying to understand where there are gaps, what facility indicators I can trust, what compliance measures I'm comfortable using. And I guess I'm wondering if there is a resource that you could offer that would give us kind of your current best understanding of what data you have that are of high enough quality for analysis, and where you have questions of your own, because that would be useful, I think, as we think about possible studies. I know, for example, in my most recent study, I was sort of instructed or guided away from some of the violations data as being unreliable, particularly on a historical basis. But I never quite know where to start when I'm studying these studies because of these data issues. So I don't know if there's a resource you could provide, or if there's staffing that would be available for questions, but I think all that would be useful upfront as we begin to think through what might be possible. Thank you.
Yeah, David, I think that's a good question. And you know, we'd have to get back to you as to where, you know, for that explanation, where to start and all that. The one thing I will say with respect to the NPDES data, I don't know how current, you know, how long ago you looked at the data and worked with it, but we have been really focused on data quality as it relates to the NPDES program and making sure that our data exchanges with the states are good. We have a complete data set. Ever since we completed the NPDES electronic reporting rule, the data quality greatly increased for the NPDES program. Where do you want to cut that off, saying, okay, data before this date might be a little bit more suspect and all that? I'm going to need to go back and think about that and what the limitations are. I just know that some of the limitations we've had in the past have gone away with that e-reporting rule. So, but good question. And we'll have to get back to the group with a response on that. I don't know, Beth, unless you have something else.
No, I think that there are very small pieces of data, or maybe certain states that we're aware of that maybe their data isn't as high quality. For example, we have, you know, when we were looking at some of the discharge monitoring report data, when we were having trouble distinguishing non-reporting from just a state's data system not transferring the data to us, we decided to look at data that just uses our EPA's net DMR system, for example, because we knew that that was not a data transfer problem between a state and us if we're just looking at that data. So in some cases we can help guide, you know, to subsets of data that we have higher confidence in if we know about smaller pieces, but it really depends on the specific kinds of data that you're looking at. But I think we've assisted with that kind of thing before, and we have some folks who can answer those kinds of questions, at least on the NPDES side. But we really have been, as John noted, really focusing a lot on data quality and that in the NPDES data in the past few years, and it's gotten a lot better. I don't know about drinking water if you're looking at that. I know that's a whole different kind of ball of wax.
Yeah, so that is a great question, very practical, a place to start. So as you know, you may know, the drinking water data that EPA collects is violation only data. In our database of record for drinking water, it's just violations. The states, some of the states do publish the compliance monitoring data. So that's sort of available on a state-by-state basis, and depending on their policies, it varies. But we can certainly pull together some information to answer some of the questions about the data. And I guess I would also say on data quality, that is one thing we're looking at on the drinking water learning agenda. That's our first question. So we're doing an evaluation, but also EPA has put a lot of work into improving the quality of CITWS data as well. So yeah, we can answer some of those questions and pull something together to send out.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, John. I've got Bridget, then I've got Levon. Bridget, jump in.
Thanks. This is extremely informative and appreciate your putting it together. I wanted to comment a little bit on the drinking water violations and highlight a recent study that USGS published on drivers of water quality issues in groundwater, emphasizing naturally occurring contaminants like arsenic and radionuclides, and also non-point source contamination from nitrate. And I think it's very important to consider the pervasive nature of these contaminants in rural areas and the difficulties of these small systems to get alternative sources. And the only option really is oftentimes treatment, which is difficult for them to manage. The other point I would like to make is to reiterate what Ashley mentioned, to have a catalogue of success stories would be great to see, you know, what has worked and how it has worked and, you know, what led to it. I mean, we have a plethora of rules and types of systems and all sorts of cases. So I think it would be great to try to develop a catalog of successes in drinking water and other systems. Thanks.
Great, Bridget, thank you. Levon?
Yeah, hi. Bridget, thank you very much. Is it possible to share that USGS study? I'm curious to see. That's one. The other thing I was going to ask was, and it relates to Paul's comment in the chat box, is how long of a time frame do you guys have in mind for this collaboration? If you do a study like an experiment and you subject some water treatments to some program, then you have to wait maybe a year or 2 or 3 to see what happens, so that would imply kind of a longer study. What do you guys have in mind? How quick of a turnaround are you thinking of?
Beth?
See what happens if you're fast to unmute, you can pivot and point to somebody else. Good work, John.
Well, I'll say we've been optimistic in the past about how quickly we can get some projects done, and they end up taking longer than we think. So I think that's a hard question to answer, but this is I think we work at government pace, right, John? These programs aren't going away. If they take a little on the longer side, I don't even know what's normal in this research arena. I don't know what the average is or what's reasonable. So, you're right. In environmental work, it's not usually quick answers, and certainly in compliance, we see some recidivism to some extent. We're looking for longer term compliance. So some of this is not, I don't envision that studies are going to be very short, but between a little longer than that and longer than that, I'm having a hard time putting a more specific.
I'll give you a different perspective. There's a timing that's related to the reality related to research, right? And what the time associated with that is to do a good job, a thorough job, and something that we could stand behind. But then I have this political reality too, right? The political leadership hears what you're doing and likes it, and we're just put out a FR notice that's proposing SNC, the NCI, NCEIs. I can't say it anymore, but which this study would play right into, right? If that we were to go forward with that one. And then we have our compliance advisor program where we actually send out technical assistance to POTW. So we have a lot of things going on that are related. And then the political leadership, here's wind of it, like offsite compliance monitoring. They wanted that study completed 2 years ago. So we have to balance that, right? We want to make sure we do a good job, that you guys could put your name behind it, right? You could publish it, whatever. But at the same time, I got to manage up.
Great, thank you. So we've got 2 people left in the queue, and I think that's going to be my number for today. So I'm going to go Brian and then Eleanor, and then we're going to wrap it up. Brian.
Okay, thank you, Rob. My name is Brian Barrett. I am a bureau chief for New Jersey DEP, and we're involved with compliance and enforcement, both with water and wastewater systems. And we're pretty busy. And so I think, talking, listening to everybody and doing what we do inspections and the enforcement actions. But ultimately, with the water systems and the wastewater systems, from an inspector's viewpoint, it comes down to O&M. And then with that O&M, one of the things in New Jersey we've been doing is looking at the asset management program of these systems. And we're really taking, ultimately it comes down to some funding and whether or not you are going to repair or replace these critical assets, and what funding is available to do that. But I think a lot of that also, when you have an effective asset management program, you are doing a lot of root cause analysis with that program, looking at the conditions of your equipment, as well as taking a look at the operations from the operator's viewpoint as well.
Yeah,
Great.
actually, I think that's great points. One thing I want to add to that, we don't want the study to take too long, right? Because as you just noted, Ryan, that there's money that's available out there, right? There's a lot of money through the infrastructure, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and then Build Back Better bill. So there's funding now out there that we could potentially get to POTWs and drinking water facilities. And maybe the findings from this could help with that funding or with that grant process. So point well taken on that.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, John. Two quick things I want to point folks to. So in the chat, Bridget has put a couple of the links that she referred to and Levon asked for. And then we've had some continued folks sharing their perspectives in the chat. So don't ignore that. So
hopefully we could capture the chat.
Yes, I will say that. I've got, let's see here, Eleanor, you're up. You're the last question here. And then I was going to do a quick next step. And then Michelle was going to come to you to wrap the call up.
Thanks. This has been very informative. And can I ask a little bit more about if you're envisioning something like a more formal RFP process, or is it if we have some projects in mind, we should send out a proposal, iterate with you on them? How are you envisioning that type of idea generation and project selection process?
Oh my goodness, Eleanor, what a perfect bridge to next steps. The check is in the mail. John, you want to jump in and then
No, actually, I'm going to turn the process stuff. I listen to my staff. They tell me what the process is. So Beth or Genevieve.
I was going to say, I can hop on. So the way that we've done it with the offsite compliance monitoring, and probably what we will do this time is, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head what the due date is, but we have people submit sort of a template. We have questions that will come in a follow-up email of like points to hit. You can make it as long or brief as you want. And that's just for us sort of kind of like a first pass to get a sense of what you're thinking about. And if there's interest there, we will reach out to schedule a time, like a 1 hour, honestly, just open conversation to kind of get our questions answered, your questions answered, so we can build a little bit better understanding of what both parties would want out of that research.
Great. And so I actually have a slide on that. Sarah, if you want to pull this slide up. And so this slide here has a lot of the links